Hi, this is Meddy Ivy Harrison. I'm the author of The Bishop's Wife and the other books in the series, including His Right Hand, For Time and All Eternities, and the latest, which is Not of This Fold. Linda Wollheim is a Mormon bishop's wife who lives in Draper, Utah, just south of Salt Lake City. And she's struggling with her faith, with her community, with her marriage. And in the first book, she is struggling with the police because a young woman who's a wife and mother in her ward has gone missing, and the police won't look for her. Linda is certain that this woman would not leave her 5-year-old little girl behind. So that's the beginning of the story. It is inspired by the Josh and Susan Powell case. If you haven't heard of that case, it ended literally the day after I wrote the first draft of this story, and it has a terrible ending. Let me just sort of try to cap it, just sort of sum it up for you. Susan had a very troubled marriage with her husband, Josh. They had 2 very young sons. I think they were 4 years old and 2 years old. Braden was one. I can't remember the name of the other. And she had talked about divorce. She had talked to people about her fears about her husband. She mostly was the financial wage earner for the family, but her husband controlled all the money. He was very controlling. And one night, she simply disappeared. Now, her husband's story was that he had gone off and taken the little boys on a camping trip, and when he got home, she was gone. The police, I think, were convinced that he had disposed of her body that night, but the children were unable to talk about it. They weren't articulate enough, and they could never find the body, and they couldn't find enough evidence that they felt like they could take him to trial and be sure that he would be convicted. So they kept delaying in hopes that they would find more evidence, and eventually Josh left the state, and his children were taken away from him because of some pornography that was found on the computer of his father that he was living with. And he finally came back to the state, got partial custody or temporary custody back of his children. A social worker had just barely left them with him in his house when the house blew up. That's the end of the story that happened the day after I finished my first draft of this book. And I was fascinated by the story. I wanted to write what I felt like were the missing parts of the story that the national media, I don't think, understood about Mormonism and how and why a woman might marry and stay with a man like Josh Powell, and why the community around her in some ways supported him. Now, I will say, people ask me this a lot, I did not do a lot of research about this story other than what I watched on the news day by day as it unfolded in Utah. And I did that actually for a specific reason. I didn't want this to be in some way exploitative of that story. So it was a jumping off point for my story. My story ends in a completely different way. The characters are all very different. I only talk about the story because it was the reason why I was compelled to write my version of this story. I had written young adult novels before. I still write young adult novels, but my career as a young adult novelist was put in jeopardy by the 2008 financial crisis, where my editor was laid off, and then I just had trouble selling books after that. And I thought that my career was over. I spent, a good year wondering what I was going to do. And in January of 2012, I sat down with my agent. He had come into town, into Park City, because one of his clients had a book made into a movie at Park City. So we had a chance to sit down. And we'd been struggling for several years to feel like we were on the same page. He was frustrated with me. I was frustrated with him. So I sat down with him and I gave him a list of, I think, 10 book ideas. And I said, this was my come to Jesus moment with my agent. I said, pick one of these. We'll spend the next year working on it, and then we'll see if we still want to work together after that, if it's been successful. So he looked down the list, and I think really close to the bottom of the list was The Bishop's Wife. And I just wrote, The Bishop's Wife, a Mormon bishop's wife investigates crime as an amateur detective. And he pointed at that and he said, whatever you do, don't write that. And I have talked about this a lot of times since then because it was a really important moment in my life as a writer. What happened was that he said, nobody wants to read about Mormons, and I believed him. It was really important for me to believe that because I was in a really bad space as a writer. I had come to really doubt whether I had anything left to say. I also had spent a long time trying to figure out how I could tell stories that other people wanted. I was obsessed with really somehow figuring out a way to guess what the audience, the sort of general American audience of readers wanted to read, and trying to satisfy that. And I really had lost my way in terms of like what I wanted to write. Sometimes my agent would ask me questions like, what's the book of your heart? And I would just be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I just want to write books that sell. And I think that he understood that meant there was something very wrong, but I didn't understand that. I didn't have attachment to a lot of my books before then. And when my agent pointed this book and said, whatever you do, don't write that, no one wants to read it, I had this really brilliant moment of like, epiphany, where I realized that was the book I wanted to write. And I wanted to write it only for me. And I actually ended up working on another book with my agent, and things didn't work out between us. We eventually parted ways. But it was an important moment for me to realize that when somebody told me no about something, first of all, I have a bit of a contrary nature, and I really wanted to do whatever he told me not to do. That probably tells you a lot about me and my childhood. My dad kept telling me as a kid growing up that I shouldn't be a writer, I should have a real job, and I think that only made me more determined to be a writer. But that was an interesting moment. So I went home literally, and the next day started working on that book. And it took me about 3 weeks to finish the first draft. I wrote it like a whirlwind. I've never written a book that fast before, certainly not one that sold so quickly after I had finished the first draft. I sent it off to my friend, Juliet Grames. Now, just as a bit of a backstory, this never happens in my life. I don't know why I tell this story except that it's a fluke. People think that it's all about who you know, and I resist against that idea because I really think that selling a book is about writing the right book. But in this particular case, I happen to know a person who really wanted this book. And Juliet and I have been friends for a number of years. We met at Sirens, which is a yearly conference, usually in Denver, Colorado, about women in fantasy. And I have been writing fantasy novels for the young adult audience, and Juliet had read some of them. And so we had gone out to dinner a few times and chatted. And I told her about this book that I had written called Vampires in the Temple, which is a kind of mystery novel, although it's paranormal, has like vampires and werewolves in it, and has Mormonism as well. And she ended up saying, no, this isn't for us. We can't do paranormal. But then she said, if you ever happen to write like a contemporary novel with Mormonism that's a mystery book, I want to see it. And then we had met up again just like 6 months before I sat down to write this book, and I said, I think I have an idea. I think I need to write a female detective to talk about the women's experience in Mormonism. And Juliet said, yeah, that's what I want to read. But I mean, I said that. I don't know how much was going on in my subconscious brain with like wanting to work on that idea in the back of my head. I wasn't aware of trying to work on it. What I was aware of was that when my agent said, don't write that book, I went home and started writing it. And it felt like it was all just written in my head, and I was just like taking dictation. Again, I say that not because it happens a lot, but because it was so rare that happened. I mean, usually I go through 10 or 12 drafts of a book. And let me just say, I did go through 6 drafts of The Bishop's Wife. We went through a lot of drafts. But it largely came out the way that I wanted it to, which surprised me. I'd never written a mystery novel before. I never thought I wanted to write a mystery novel before. But that said, I loved mysteries. I've always loved mysteries. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with Sherlock Holmes. I remember I wrote a book of trivia about Sherlock Holmes just because I was obsessed. I read and reread everything about Sherlock Holmes. And Perry Mason. I was obsessed with Perry Mason when I was a teenager. Also, I made my mom drive miles and miles around to try to find libraries that had books in the Perry Mason series that I hadn't read. And so I read as many as I could. There are a lot of books in that series. And so those are the sort of foundations of my interest in mysteries. And in fact, when I was a teenager, I wrote a lot of fan fiction novels, and 2 of them were a Sherlock Holmes fan fiction book called His Last Case. I used to have it up on my website. I don't think it's there anymore. And I wrote a Perry Mason fan fiction piece also. So those are my background. And of course, I mean, I'm like everybody. I watch a lot of television that is about crime solving. So in some sense, I knew kind of what the beats were. I also had loved, since my 20s, loved Agatha Christie. I probably read almost all the Agatha Christie books. I won't say that I read all of them, but I read a lot of them. And I'd also read a lot of Anne Perry. I found out that Anne Perry was Mormon, and that fascinated me. Also that she's single. Because one of the reasons I love her books is she has 2 series that I really, really love, both set in the 1800s. One is earlier and one is in the later sort of post-Victorian era. But there's 2 couples, and her depiction of the relationship between those 2 couples is absolutely fascinating. And just real, so real. Like that's one of my frustrations as somebody who's married, that I feel like a lot of storytellers seem to think that the only things that are interesting in marriage are like either falling in love or breaking up. And marriage is interesting in a lot of different ways, so that's annoying to me. I wish there were better marriages depicted generally in fiction, and Anne Perry is an example of that. Plus, I mean, the mysteries are fun. They're always have lots of political backstory going on and tell you a lot about the time period. They're very dense in terms of historical information. I love that. And then, and also, I will say I actually ended up meeting Anne Perry, I think the year after The Bishop's Wife came out in 2015. We were at a dinner together, and I ended up finagling a seat next to her. We were both up for the Whitney Award for Mormon fiction, and I talked to her a bit. We had an argument about Orson Scott Card, which she mostly won. And then I sent her a letter asking her to read His Right Hand, which is book 2 in the series. And she sent me a lovely letter back, which I have framed and in my front room. It fell off of the wall during the earthquake that we had recently, but I quickly put it back up. It's one of my most prized possessions, and her quote is on that book. Anyway, side story. One of the best things about being a writer, honestly, is meeting other writers who are your idols. It is one of the best things and one of the worst things, because you get about half and half of writers who are just terrible human beings in person, and writers who are just incredibly fascinating, interesting people, and you're just so glad that you got to meet them on a personal level. So, Anne Perry I read a lot of, and I also read a lot of the Spencer books by, who is that? Robert Parker. And wow, those are good books. And it was interesting to me to watch him doing what it turns out I'm doing with my books, which is have time pass more slowly in his world in a weird way. Like the characters age more slowly, even though the events of the times all happen. That's what's happening with Linda, is her personal life timeline is like in a different universe than the regular universe, so that I can still talk about whatever issues I want to talk about that are going on right now within Mormonism. But Linda and her family just take longer. Like her son's on a mission from 2015 to 2020, even though he's only on a 2-year mission. And her husband's going to be bishop for 5 years, but that will take a long time, until like 10 books into the series. Whoever knows, when that will end. But that was one of the choices I watched Robert Parker make with the Spencer books, and I never thought I would do it myself, but I just don't know how to fix it. I also read a lot of Sue Grafton. Sue Grafton is one of my favorite authors. She did the Alphabet series with Kinsey Milhone, and she made a different choice. She started writing those books in the 80s, and as publication moved on, she decided to leave Kinsey in the 80s. And so the books become historical fiction, as the 2000s and 2010s come along. And so she has to keep researching to remind herself of what it was like to live in the 80s. Anyway, that was the other choice I could have made. I didn't make that choice. I didn't want to talk about things about Mormonism in the past. I wanted to be able to keep talking about things about Mormonism in the present. So that was one of the choices that I made. Anyway, that's my background, like, of why I was drawn to mystery, even though I never thought of myself as a mystery writer. And I will admit, many other mystery writers are very regimented and they plan their books out in a way that I do not. They have intricate graphs of all of the clues that they've set in their suspects, and I kind of fly by the seat of my pants, just like I did with my fantasy novels. That is part of the joy, and I think there is a certain spark of unexpectedness that comes with that. So when I started writing The Bishop's Wife, I didn't know who the murderer was. I had some ideas, but actually my early ideas of who the murderer was didn't turn out to be interesting. And so I kept introducing new suspects. And I think this is actually a fair strategy for a mystery writer. Introduce suspects, they all have a reason, they all have motive and opportunity, and play with them for a while. One of my friends said that this is the British strategy of mysteries, like everybody wanted to do it because that person was terrible. Whereas the American style of mystery is more linear, like you look up clues and the clues all lead you in the right direction. Anyway, if that's true, then I guess I'm more of a British mystery writer. Although I don't know that I read that much British mystery, except for Sherlock Holmes. Anyway, I sat down each day during that 3-week period thinking to myself, I hope I find out who the murderer is. I hope it works. And after I finished that last draft, I said the end. Like I said, the next day I woke up and heard the end of the real Josh Powell story and was horrified. But I'd already sent this off to my editor, the person who became my editor at the time. I never thought she was going to buy this book because she'd explained to me that Soho only sells international crime. And so when I sent it to her, I was just like, hey, I'm just looking for your opinion. Do you think anyone in a national market would be interested in this book? Because it's so much about Mormonism. I also sent it to a couple of friends of mine who are quite liberal, and one of them is Mormon, one is an atheist, and I asked them their opinion also about it, if they thought that the Mormon market might be interested in it. So these 3 people all read the book within a couple of weeks. And my 2 friends who know more about the Mormon market were like, no, there's just no way that you're ever gonna sell it. And I was like, but I could edit it. And they're like, no, you can't edit this book into something that the Mormon market will be interested in. More on that later. And Juliet got back to me, and she had read it on an airplane flight, and she loved it. And she said, I have to buy this book. And I was stunned because even in my best case scenario, I hadn't imagined that. And then I had to figure out, what am I going to do? How can I tell my agent? I guess I just have to tell him what happened. Like, I didn't intend to sell it to her. When you have an agent, you're not supposed to go around and submit manuscripts behind your agent's back. I mean, that's not really what I did, but it could have appeared that that's what I did. I hadn't told him that I was sending it to her because I didn't think it would lead to publication. Anyway, so I asked Juliet how it was that she was going to buy this book about a Mormon murder mystery when her line was all about international crime. And this was the answer she came up with. She says that I said this to her, but I think that she said it to me. She said, Mormons are another country. They speak another language, and you are their translator. So that was the line that we went with. Since then, Soho has published other books set in America, but often books that are in some kind of interesting culture that is different than typical white American culture. So, I mean, that's sort of the beginning of the story of what happened. It was another 2 years after Juliet saw that first manuscript that the book came out, and it did go through a lot of edits. I don't know if you're interested in hearing what kinds of edits it went through, but I'm going to just talk about 2. The first round of edits, Juliet explained to me that when you have an amateur detective, you need to have a reason that person is drawn to solve crimes, especially if it's a series. There has to be some kind of reason. If they're not a police officer, if it's not their job, why do they keep getting drawn back into crimes? And she suggested that it needed to be a character reason. So I had to think back on that. And in this draft was when I started thinking about why Linda would be so driven to solve crimes about women. And I ended up deciding that's what ultimately she would be doing. Let me just say, not every murder victim is a woman, but all the cases have to do with women. Just trying to leave a mystery there, not to tell you too much about the stories. But I put into her backstory a little of my own backstory, which is that she has 5 sons, and I gave her a daughter who died at birth. Well, she was stillborn. And her daughter's name is Georgia. Now, I had experienced a stillbirth in 2005 with my youngest child, and I'm still grieving that, really. I don't know that you ever recover from that. People pretend to recover because socially that's what's acceptable. The people learn to say the lessons that they learn from that kind of thing. And Linda is still very torn by this loss of her daughter more than 20 years before the book begins. And in some way, she is looking for her daughter in the face of every woman she meets that's the age that she thinks her daughter would have been. And she somehow feels like she has to save all the women around her because that's her penance for losing her daughter. She feels this enormous guilt. She didn't do anything, but she still feels this guilt. Like, if you're a mother, you're supposed to keep your children alive. So that's what Linda has as her backstory to motivate her to continue to get involved in particular kinds of crimes within Mormonism. And so that was the first draft that we did. And as Juliet and I worked through various other drafts in the book, Juliet was so fascinated by Mormonism. She kept asking me to explain more and more things about Mormonism. So when we finally got to the draft, which turned out to be the ARC, that's ARC, stands for Advanced Reader Copy. And that's what people send out to promote books to reviewers. And we handed out a bunch of these books to people in the biz at various conferences that I went to before the book was officially published to try to get, more buzz. And that ARC was the draft before we sent it to the copy editor. And one of the things that Juliet asked the copy editor to do specifically was to cut back on my explanations of Mormonism. With the idea that perhaps not all readers would be as fascinated by the nitty-gritty details of Mormon rituals and culture as Juliet herself was. So between that ARC copy and the final printed copy, we cut, I think, 10,000 words out of the book. So every once in a while, I'll meet somebody who says that the copy they read just goes on and on and on about Mormonism, and then I ask them, did you read an ARC or did you read an actual printed, published copy? And usually they say that they read an ARC. I will say that Mormon readers who read The Bishop's Wife sometimes do complain about being told things that they already know, and I get frustrated with that because Mormon readers are generally used to only 2 kinds of books about Mormons. One is books that are written by either ex-Mormons or people who are trying to write some kind of expose about Mormons and are very negative about Mormonism, talk a lot about it being a cult. And Mormons don't generally read those books, but it does happen. But the kind of books Mormons mostly read are books published by Deseret Book or, the alternate Covenant Books or Cedar Fort. Those are all sort of niche Mormon publishers that sell books only, basically within the Wasatch Front area to Mormons. And in those books, Mormons are used to reading about people who are like them, who speak the language, who know the lingo. And so Mormons don't know what to do with a book that is neither one nor the other. It's not anti-Mormon, but it's also not written to the insider group. And I think that is why this book was so popular, both with the national audience and with, a certain group of Mormons, because it's like the first of its kind that treats Mormonism neutrally. It's just a culture. I explain it. I'm not trying to convert people to Mormonism. In fact, in the years since The Bishop's Wife was published, I have myself stopped attending Mormon Church. I have not resigned my membership. It's possible that will happen, depending on how angry the church leadership makes me, I suppose. Some people might argue that they could have read The Bishop's Wife and they could tell that I was going to leave. That's not how I would describe what happened, but when the 2015 November policy came out as a response to gay marriage becoming legal in the United States, the Mormon Church said that any same-sex couples who were married were automatically considered apostates and would be excommunicated, and that their children would not be allowed to attend church. And that just made me furious for so many reasons. I would say that is the thing that sort of led me on a slow path out, although there were other things also. I would say other problems I have with the church are just sort of generally the authoritarian structure, the way in which we outsource our relationship with God to other people and let them tell us what God has to say for us. That bothers me. Women's issues, a host of things. I write a lot about Mormonism. If you're interested, you can go look up my posts on Huffington. If you go to my website, MettyIvyHarrison.com, I have a list of some of my best Huffington Post essays. I also write on Medium right now. Every week on Monday, I publish a new essay on Medium about Mormonism, and you can go there and read what I have to say about whatever the current events are. I just published one about does God cause COVID-19? And I wrote that just in the middle of this coronavirus shutdown, which this video is also part of what I'm trying to do to get people, so that they're not so bored at home going crazy, and also maybe to help my book sales, which are having problems right now. So let's see, I have a list of questions here. Let me see if I can say a few other things about my life. So I sometimes tell these two funny stories about a Mormon book club that I went to shortly after The Bishop's Wife was published. And I think this will tell you something about what Mormons expect from books about Mormons. As I said, they're mostly used to reading books for insiders. And the books that they might read that are for a national audience are generally of a proselytizing nature, which this book is not. So one of the women in this class, after I talked about, in this book club, after I talked about, where the book came from and my process of writing it, she asked me, she said, I like the book, but I wanted to know why Linda didn't kneel down to pray and ask God who the murderer was at the end of the book. And why did she have to go through all of this? She's wrong. She thinks this person did it. She investigates. Then she's wrong again. This is what happens with Linda. And the woman was like, she should have just prayed, and then God would tell her. And I kind of smiled a little and thought, well, first of all, that really wouldn't work for a national audience for a series of books. Like, oh, wait till the next book. Linda will kneel down and pray again, and then God will tell her exactly who the murderer is. It just wouldn't fly in terms of the genre. But also I said to her, it's just not my experience with prayer. I don't get answers that are that clear. And I found it fascinating. This woman came back to me and said, oh, well, that's my experience with prayer. You must just not understand God very well. If you pray harder, then you'll get to a point where all of your prayers are answered absolutely clearly. And I was just astonished that it's not my experience with God or with, I don't know, how we find answers to things. It was a little scary to me sometimes to think about as I think back on that. And then the woman said the second thing, which was that she really wished that I had ended the book with the murderer being like somebody outside of the community, a non-Mormon. And again, this astonished me because I was like, this is a book about Mormonism. Again, like in a series like this, I can't just have it be some random non-Mormon that you haven't met before. Also, I just thought, like, reality says that you just read the news, and Mormons are murderers all the time. Mormons commit lots of crimes. Just in fact, we don't have fewer crimes in Utah than we have in other states in the country. It appears that Mormons are just as likely to commit crimes against each other as anybody else. But that just wasn't her view of Mormonism. And I think she also felt that I should be working to proselytize. And I have gotten, if you want to have a fun time, you can go and read my reviews on Amazon, and you'll be able to tell which ones are from Mormons, because the complaint from most of Mormons is, you don't make us look good. I'm like, no, I don't make you look good. That's not my job. My job was to like tell the, I don't know if I should say the truth, like the truth is this special, special thing, like only I know the truth. But I wanted to do something that was vaguely realistic. And again, it was so funny to me. I think I ended up saying to her, I've heard from a lot of non-Mormon readers, and they really like these books. They said they felt like the Mormons feel more realistic and more likable in these books than anything else they've seen about Mormons. And I think that some non-Mormons feel like the church's attempts to, do PR campaigns, the I'm a Mormon campaign, or the commercials that I used to watch in the 70s and 80s, Nina through the glass, and like, hey, you need to spend time with your family. Those sorts of campaigns actually bothered people, because they made it seem like Mormons were somehow superior or better than other people, almost Stepford Wives-ish. And they really liked these people really liked my books, because they were like, wow, I understand Mormons better now. And because I bothered to explain things about Mormonism and to have it make sense, have Mormon rituals and our understandings of God and ourselves, I explained them in simple terms to other people so that they did not feel so strange about Mormon beliefs. I think I do a good job in that. And again, I just made Mormons regular people. Like, they make mistakes, they have arguments, they're not perfect, they're not better than anybody else. I think that was really appealing to a lot of people. So I'm looking at my other questions here. One of the other things I was going to say is that the first novel that I published for young adults is called The Monster in Me. It's out of print, but you can find it on Amazon. I've put it back up as an ebook. It has a runner on the cover. It's about a girl who's a runner. She's not Mormon, but she is in a foster family in Heber, Utah, who is Mormon. I never say the word Mormon. I don't even say LDS. The prayers that they say in the book are very sort of generic Christian, in part because I was worried that Christians would hate my Mormons, but also just because when I first started writing, when I was in my 30s, I wasn't comfortable talking about Mormonism in any significant way. I was a little embarrassed about it, unsure. I felt like it was kind of naive, and it took me almost 20 years to figure out how to write about Mormonism in a way, even though I think I was trying to at that time period when I wrote that first book that was published. So I think I'll end with just a few recommendations. If you are someone who wants to be a writer, every once in a while, people from a book club ask me how you become a writer, so I'll give you a very short explanation of how you become a writer. As I said, I wanted to be a writer when I was very young. I started saying that I wanted to be a writer when I was in kindergarten, and I kept saying it over and over and over again. And I started writing books when I was in junior high, like full-length novels. And I wrote over a lot of fan fiction when I was in high school, as I said. But then I stopped writing while I was in college, frankly, because I was too busy. I was writing a lot of papers. And I started writing again only when I was in my third year of grad school. When I was supposed to be working on my dissertation, I started writing some short stories and a novel that's never been published because it's not very good. And I dabbled. I sent things out to agents. If you're curious, you can go online. You can Google, top agents in young adult or top agents in mystery. And you can get information right online. At the time, I looked up this big book, Writer's Market, which was available as a reference book from the reference desk of our local library. And so I would go and read it and then write down information about agents. Now it's much easier. You can go to Writer's Market online, and I think you have to pay a monthly fee, but they are very helpful. They give you really direct information, clearly laid out what each agent wants. You do need to write a query letter, which is 1 page, Don't go on and on. Just really simple. Explain your story in a paragraph or two. Say what genre it is. Say how long it is. If you know the agent in any particular way, or you follow them on Twitter, or you have looked at their website, you can just say those things. Then your final paragraph is just about you, like why you write this book. If it's going to be your first published novel, just say that. There's nothing embarrassing about that. And then each agent will tell you exactly what they want. Some agents will want you to attach the first 10 pages. Some will want you to do a synopsis. Some will want you to cut, copy, and paste and put it into your email. And then you just send it off and you wait. Many agents these days have gone to no response means no. If you end up getting an offer from an agent and you haven't heard back from other agents, then you can send a follow-up email to any of them and say, hey, I've gotten an offer. Do you want to hurry up and read and see if you're interested in representing me? Now, when I sold my first book, The Monster in Me, I sold it directly to a publisher. Even then, that was starting to be more rare. These days, it's almost unheard of unless it's a very niche local publisher. You will have to use an agent because the big national publishers won't look at books unless you have an agent. I mean, they literally will not even respond. So you have to have an agent. And if you look up online, one of the things you want to do is, if you're about ready to sign with an agent, ask the agent for the name of 3 of their clients and contact those clients. This is just to make sure they're legit, make sure that the clients are happy with them. You can ask the clients, are there any flaws that you think? If people only tell you the flaws, I don't know. I mean, I think every agent has a flaw. Good to know them in advance. So you get an agent, then your agent sells the book for you. The agent gets 15%. The agent negotiates the contract, which is very good. You want an agent to negotiate a contract for you because they will get much, much better terms. Agents often have a boilerplate that they work with, that they've already hammered out with a publisher, so that you don't have to do all that work again. And agents just routinely can get you more money. They can also make sure you retain audiobook rights or movie rights, other various things. So that's why you need an agent. I would not sell a book to a national publisher without an agent. I would just never do it. I don't recommend anybody do it. There's just too many dangers, especially if you get a big advance. You can end up. I've had contracts canceled now twice, and ended up fearing losing my house because I thought that the publisher was going to demand the money back and I'd already spent it. So just don't do it without an agent. My agent in both of those cases protected me from any problems with that. Just as a matter of course, I don't even think that my agent remembers doing this because he did it all the time. So you want an agent. And the other couple of things that I have to say about this are, one, if you're publishing with a national press, you need to know that it takes a long time. And there's a good reason it takes a long time. People sometimes get impatient and they think, oh, I could just do a self-published book. Yes, you can. It won't be as good. Because, I'm not trying to slam all self-published writers. There are some self-published writers who are very, very good at this. But the better they are at it, the longer it takes them. Because a good writer goes through multiple drafts of revision, gets lots of different editors to look at it. And that's why it takes me so long. I have to not only go through a draft with my editor, but with her boss, and then, multiple other readers, and then finally the copy editor. It just goes through a lot of revisions. And sometimes people say to me, oh, then they're just making you have the book say what they want it to say. No. They're helping me to make it more clear what I want to say. They're helping make the book better. It is better. And they also catch a lot of errors of various different kinds, not just typos. So that's one reason that it takes a long time. And the other problem is that sometimes I hear people say to me things like, well, I just won't need to have my book edited so many times because it'll be perfect in the first draft. This is just the wrong way to think about it. And I am sometimes astonished that people say this to me when I am a national best-selling author who has had 15 books published and am teaching a class, and they tell me that they won't need to go through as many drafts. And I think, so you're saying you're a much better writer than I am, even though that this is what I have done my entire life. Okay, that's an interesting thing to say to your teacher. If it's not taking you a lot of drafts, then what's really going on is that you're not listening. And to me, that is the major difference between writers who are capable of being published nationally and capable of getting better year after year, is that they listen. Yes, it's painful to listen and to hear that you're making a mistake. You've watched reality TV shows. You know what this is like. You know when you hear somebody on Project One Runway get told by Tim Gunn that's not going to work, and then they ignore it, and then they get kicked off. That's your book. Just don't do that. Hopefully you will go through multiple drafts before you send it to an agent. Often I let books sit for 6 months so that I can look at them more clearly. Hopefully in the 6 months I've mostly forgotten what's going on in the book, and I can look at it as if it's somebody else had written it. And then I can see the mistakes in it and write myself an editorial letter and start fixing it. That's the ideal. I did also want to say one last thing, and that is, I said that I always write by the seat of my pants without knowing what happens in advance, and that's not always true. With the Linda Wollheim series now, I have gotten good enough at it that I know the characters, and so I do often do a quick, maybe 5-page, well, maybe 3-page sketch of chapter by chapter what's going to happen in the book, and I often stick to it pretty well, not 100% well. Sometimes things take me off in a different direction. Sometimes those things are wrong, and I have to go back to the outline. Sometimes they are right. But it has been useful, I think, for my editor to have an outline to look at and say, this is working, this needs to change in outline form before I spend all of the time to write a full draft. I am just going to admit it's taken me 20 years to get to a point where I can write an outline. And some people learn how to do that faster. For me, I really do have this intuitive sense of how a story feels and how it moves, and I didn't want to lose that with an outline. I still think that the best parts of my books are the characters. You might be interested to know that in first drafts of my books, it's almost always talking heads, like a lot of dialogue, because that's what my books are. They're mostly about character interactions with each other and people changing because of their interactions with each other. Yes, they're mystery novels, but the plot elements are often, in my mind, ways to get the characters to reveal themselves, to understand themselves, and then to change. So I write mystery. I hope that I have good plot, but it's plot that is for the character. So I think my main focus is on character, and I hope that that is why people read The Bishop's Wife, because they fall in love with Linda, and they fall in love with her relationships with her family members. And that's why every book is always going to have like the next thing that happens to her family and the next challenge that she has to deal with while dealing with her family. That's the future that I have for the books. If you want to contact me, you have any other questions about this, I'm always happy to talk to readers. You can contact me, you can go to my website, as I said before, MettyIvyHarrison.com, or you can send a message directly to my email, which is ironmom, IRONMOMM, @gmail. I have that email because I am an Ironman triathlete, and also I have a memoir about doing Ironman called Iron Mom, if you ever want to look that up. It's by a very small publisher, but it was a fun thing to write. And I hope this has been helpful, and keep reading the books.